may I talk to you about a man whom Billy Graham said was the most respected pastor in the world. I knew him, I've talked with him, I've corresponded with him. He was a happy, intelligent man. His name, John Stott, wrote over 50 books. His father, an agnostic, a Harley Street specialist. But John Stott found the gospel. One of his earliest books is called Basic Christianity. If you read that, and you can read it in about an hour, you know what Christianity is about. John Stott chose to live a celibate life. He was handsome. He was very attractive. He spent most of his worshipping life at All Souls Church in London. Jill and I have attended there when he spoke. He met with a lot of opposition because he was an evangelical. But writing 50 books, preaching in many parts of the world, he influenced millions. He wasn't afraid to say that marriage is one man with one woman, as Genesis says in the 3rd chapter, and as Christ said in Matthew 19. He wasn't afraid to say that. But he wasn't afraid to tell preachers where they went wrong. He even had a controversy with Martin Lloyd-Jones, a very wonderful Christian preacher, but Stott disagreed with him in certain areas and wasn't afraid to say so. John Stott did not believe in an eternal hell. He believed that those who rejected the love of God would one day fall asleep forever. No hellfire. I think it was David Edwards that he had controversy with in a book called Essentials. So Stott wasn't afraid to be different, but he was of all men thoughtful, courteous, kind, intelligent. He wrote a commentary on Romans, which I would recommend to you. No commentary is infallible, but there's a great deal of good in this commentary. He wrote a wonderful book on preaching, at least one. Here it is, Biblical Preaching Today, in which he warned preachers not to bore the congregation, but to have something that would give life, like his own preaching. Authentic Christianity, issues facing Christians today. Time magazine had an article, The 100 People Who Have Most Influence in the World. John Stott was one of them. Can you see this man living alone, celibate, studious, visiting the sick, visiting the poor, taking great meetings and convocations around the world, his whole life given to Christ. I heard him preach when he was about 83. He retired at 86. He died in 2011. He was 90. When I heard him preach, my heart was very much touched. He was a gentle person. He was a loving person. He was a wise person. I recommend to you John Stott. Begin with his book, Basic Christianity. It's on Romans, a few chapters of Romans. Then have a look at his commentary on Romans. And then he deals with the issues of today, including homosexuality. He had great sympathy for homosexuals, but he did not agree in homosexual practice. So he was a man who defied his world, but ended by conquering it. Millions in the world thank God for John Stott. If you meet him through his books, you'll thank God also. Now let me tell you something else. Here's a book called Great Women of the Christian Faith. Women are not dealt with fairly in our world. In much of the world, they do 90% of the work, get 1% of the wealth from that work. It's not a fair world. And yet women have virtues that men often lack. If I was going to be tried for my life, I'd rather have a female judge. So here is a book by Edith Dean, which deals with many of the women who have influenced the world. She begins in the 2nd century, and century after century, she points out women who have influenced the world for Christ. I recommend this book to you. Now let me talk about Henry Drummond. The best book on Henry Drummond, here it is by George Adam Smith. Henry Drummond wrote the greatest thing in the world on 1 Corinthians 13. As long as there are human beings in the world, Drummond's book will be read. I memorised it, gave it as a sermon once. It's only a little book, or I couldn't have done it. Henry Drummond was a scientist, an evangelist, worked with Moody for 2 years. A missionary, went to Africa, Central Africa. When people asked him, what was it like in Central Africa? He gave them a one-word answer: death. This is the best book on Drummond, by George Adam Smith. George Adam Smith is a Bible commentator that is known to all scholars. He discusses in this book life, death, teachings. He discusses, for example, that great book, Natural Law in the Spiritual World. I read it about 70 years ago, was greatly blessed by it. Not infallible, but wonderfully written, wonderfully practical. He saw what Christ meant when he said, behold the lilies of the field. Even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Drummond saw God in everything. And he preached and wrote, taught in universities, and because of him, university students scoured Scotland, taking the gospel they'd learned from Henry Drummond. Henry Drummond, as a scientist, was not a fundamentalist. He believed in the inspiration of the early chapters of Genesis, but he did not believe in the way fundamentalists tried to explain them. Fortunately, to say the world is only 6,000 years old is ridiculous. There are about 47 radioactive minerals in the earth that all agree about the age of the world. No scientist of any repute believes in a 6,000-year-old, and the Bible does not teach it, so we shouldn't. So Drummond had things to say like that. They loved him because he was lovely, he was kind, he was courteous, he was good, he was decent. Going along a street in Edinburgh, seeing children playing with marbles, he'd kneel down and play with them. He would visit the sick, the lonely, write to people in need. But Henry Drummond had 2 awful years with bone cancer. He died in his 40s of bone cancer. having written some of the greatest books the world had ever seen, The Ascent of Man, greatest thing in the world, Natural Law and the Spiritual World. They're all from Henry Drummond. But he had 2 terrible years when he couldn't even lift a page of paper without pain. What was he like in those 2 years? He still had a sense of humour. He still was interested in people. People who visited him went away enriched. It may be he did more in his dying than in his living, though in his living he had helped so many thousands. He is another one who demonstrates what the Bible is trying to tell us. Trust God in everything, however dangerous, however difficult, however painful. Trust God in everything. Death is not the end. Remember what Paul said. For me to live is Christ. To die is gain. For the Christian, death is only a moment of sleep, then glory at the return of Christ. How wonderful. The shadow enshrouding death has been removed by the resurrection of Christ. You remember when our Lord died, many graves opened. There was earthquake. And after Christ's resurrection, many saints left their graves, especially near Jerusalem. And after Christ left that wonderful death gift from Joseph of Arimathea, the resurrected ones went into Jerusalem and talked to them about Christ. It pointed to the end of the world, when again God will say it is finished, and there'll be a great earthquake. Read about it in Revelation 16. And the graves will be opened, and all the saints will rise. The wicked not till another 1,000 years. There are 2 resurrections separated by a millennium of 1,000 years when the earth is desolate. Well, in that history of Christ, we learn not to fear death. It's only a temporary thing. Then glory. Henry Drummond knew it, and he could endure 2 years of terrible pain and smile and love and do for God whatever a dying man could do. I recommend you read The Greatest Thing in the World and Natural Law in the Spiritual World and The Ascent of Man. God bless you.